going to be about that concept of love. So you've taken, okay, sharing what you have is love, and God is loving, so you do that action, right? So I would disagree with that definition of love, because I would think that's sort of anthropomorphic. You're taking what humans would do and then giving it to a divine. The second point I would, just off the top of my head, would be why three? Because it doesn't necessitate, you can say minimalistically it has to be more than one, but I don't understand why it's three. The third issue that I have with this argument is that it's about the chronological sequence, right? So is it the case that there was a being and then the being decided to share, which means that T0 there was one being and T2 there was three beings, if we're going to go with three. And that would basically mean the nature of God changed, which again goes against the Bible. So these three objections, off the top of my head, I'm thinking...
I'll start with the third, because it's
sure.
No, there was no temporal duration or temporal delay in the inevitable bringing about of the second and third divine person, because it's an inevitable action of the nature of that being. So that being, the first divine person, cannot exist if there is not, from T0, the second divine person and the third divine person, because he wouldn't have the attribute of perfect goodness. And I didn't say it before, but all of these attributes are essential attributes. The being that has it must have it if he's to exist. So, give an example. If God wasn't omnipotent, if a being wasn't omnipotent, he's not God. He has to have that attribute to be God. He has to have the attribute omnipotence to be God. So the idea here is that if there wasn't that second and third divine person from the get-go, from T0, then that first divine person would not exist. Right. So it's an inevitable bringing about of the second and third divine person.
So, Josh, would you say that this argument presupposes that these are necessary and sufficient conditions for that being to exist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry, I want to attack the second one as well before I forget it. The second point you have.
Yeah, I actually, but okay.
Do you want to?
I want to dismantle this one. So if you're saying there's sufficient and necessary conditions, then that would basically mean that the very analogy which you began off with, or you're taking Richard's argument, which is you took an analogy which is about a choice. That wouldn't you do that? Isn't this an inevitable action you would take? How that seems a bit like it doesn't. It seems like a contradiction between that and then if it's always been like that. So it's not a choice anymore.
Okay, so I think when I was trying to explain it, I sort of presented it as there's a dilemma, there needs to be a choice that God will make, but it's not like that.
Okay, it's a different...
Yeah, it's not like that. Sorry, I think it's just the way I was presenting it at the beginning for us to understand it. But what you have to understand is that there are two different actions that can be performed by God. Acts of essence and acts of will. Acts of essence are just things that God will inevitably do because of his nature. So, like perform a good action. If there's a good action here, God will inevitably do it because he is good, because of his nature. That's an act of essence. An act of will is where God will choose to do it, but he's not necessitated by his essence, by his nature. So creating the world is an example. God didn't have to create the world. He could have decided not to create the world at all. That's an act of will. What I'm arguing here...
Okay, so just to clarify.
Yes.
Would that mean basically, like in the Quran, and I'm sure in the Bible, I don't know the Bible that well, but for example, God does not do injustice, right? So an act of essence is that God would not allow injustice on the Day of Judgment. Right? Okay. And an act of will would be, for example, that God made this tree and it has one main offshoot, but God could have two. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So how does that link to...
Yeah, so the idea here is that the bringing about of the second and third divine persons are an act of essence. They have nothing to do with choice. God can't choose to not do it. It's just something that happens because he is constituted in that way. Because he's perfectly good, he will inevitably, from T0, bring about that second divine person and the third divine person.
But I don't understand, like, for example, the Day of Judgment is in the future.
Okay.
And if it's like an act of essence, you called it, which is that God would not allow injustice on that day. Justice would happen, is where you have T0 and then you have T1 in which God, he will not allow injustice, an act of essence. But in this case, you're saying, okay, it's inevitable, but you're also saying it's eternal. It's always been that way. No, and I'm trying to understand how that works.
What I mean, I think maybe that example with the day I think that example with the day of judgment is a little bit more cloudy. Let's just, if we can just stick with this example in creation, because I think it's a lot easier,
Sure.
then maybe I can unpack it. So what I'm saying is an act of will is something which God just chooses to do, but he's not necessitated by the way that he is. Because of him being...
I get that, I get that.
So him created. An act of essence is just something that he must do. Off the top of my head, outside of the two divine persons, I can't think of one. So I think that one with the justice one, I think it can get a little bit more mucky, and it actually might be an act of will more than an act of essence. So if you can think of one off the top of your head.
But from an Islamic theological framework, and I thought this was true for Christianity,
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Yes.
Injustice is something God says that he will not allow, and also that, but the way Islamic scholars explain it is that Allah gives laws, God gives laws, no one imposes laws on Allah. However, Allah gives himself, he gives himself, careful with the language here, but basically he says, for example, I will not do injustice, meaning he will never do injustice, right? So he has certain promises and he never fails in those promises, okay? So justice, I think it would be an act of essence from your perspective. But let's go to the second point. I forgot what it was.
Yeah, the second point was the main one.
What was the second point again?
I lost it as well, but it was actually the main one. Oh yeah, it was asking why 3. I think you said why does it lead to
I think so.
2 other divine persons?
And I've forgotten the third point.
Yeah. Okay, so that's actually the main critique. You'll say, okay, let's now give you this. Why does it lead to a second and third divine person and not more divine persons?
Or less.
Whatever. The idea here is because there are different qualitative forms of love. So you have cooperation in sharing your love and sharing your love. So I'll start with the first one. The qualitative action of sharing your love requires there to be another person to share your love with.
Okay, so I lost you slightly. You need to go back slightly. You said qualitative love?
There's a qualitative distinction between different types of love.
Right.
So there is sharing love, there's cooperation in sharing your love.
Cooperation
in sharing your love.
In sharing your love. So sharing your love and cooperation in sharing your love. Okay.
So sharing your love just requires one other person. Okay, because I have my love, I then share it with another person, they reciprocate the action and share it with you. So we're sharing love together.
Got it.
Yeah. Then cooperation and sharing love is where you love each other and then you work together to share that love that you have with another, with a third. So the idea here is, so a very human example, which will have issues, is a family, okay, that will have issues. But we can go with it because it just helps understand a little bit better. So I love my wife, we're sharing our love. We then together work together to cooperate with the love that we have, we cooperate together to share that love with, let's say, a child or something else. So you have that love that you have. And then
so that's the cooperation to share the love?
Yes. So there's 2 distinctions. There's sharing love and cooperating and sharing love. Now, the idea here is that sharing love requires another divine person for the first divine person, for them to share their love. Then cooperating and sharing their love, these 2, requires a third divine person for them to be able to share that love with. But then, there is no other qualitative distinction between cooperating and sharing the love and another form of love. So the idea here is because love is bettered by sharing, love is then bettered by cooperating and sharing, but there is no betterment of love after that. And so that then means that if God was to bring about a 4th divine person for all 3 to cooperate in sharing their love, then the thing would be that will be then an act of will, because it's not necessitated by his nature. It's only necessitated by his nature that he shares his love and that he cooperates in sharing his love. But anything more than that doesn't require that act of essence.
Okay.
It's an act of will.
Sure. So,
but then an act of will mean that then God will create that divine person, and then that divine person will not be ontologically equal with the other 3, and thus will not be divine.
Right. Yeah. So there's an additional problem that I just thought of.
Yes.
And thank you for explaining that, because it's sometimes you have to,
Yeah.
But it's correct me if I'm wrong. It's an act of essence that God, from this argument, would create some entity to share the love with and an entity to cooperate to share the love with.
Yes.
But it would be an act of will to create a 4th entity.
Yes.
Okay.
Or any more,
But someone can say, well, it may not be an act of essence, it may be an act of will, but it could have happened.
Okay, but the problem that you have is another essential attribute of a divine person is metaphysical necessity. Now the problem is metaphysical necessity means that being cannot not have existed. Now the problem that you have is any being that's created by will is contingent. It didn't have to exist. So with that argument here, by creating that fourth divine person, that divine person would be contingent rather than necessary. And so then might not have existed, and thus will not have the essential attribute of metaphysical necessity, and so wouldn't be divine in the same way as the other three divine persons.
Okay, so
those three divine persons are each necessary, metaphysically necessary.
And you would say the fourth one would be contingent because it would come from an act of will.
Act of will. He didn't have to exist.
And also, at one point, it did not exist.
And one point did not exist.
Okay, so now coupling this problem with the initial, I just remembered what my other problem was, which is why that definition of love. The definition of love is, okay, so you have a wife, you share everything with your wife,
yes.
And then you have a child, and then with you and your wife, you then cooperate and share that. You're taking those definitions and you're throwing them up towards the divine, right? Metaphysically. So how does? Oh yeah, but you had those people at your. What was that point? Yeah. So this definition, like, why should we go with it?
Yeah. So I take a specific view in religious language called the univocal view. So I take that terms that we use for God are univocal when they're used in a normal, mundane human context.
I don't understand. Say that.
Sorry. I take a univocal view to our use of language. Univocal just basically means when we use a word, it's used in the same way as when we apply it to God. So if I understand what goodness is by a human context, that is also applicable to God in the same way.
Right, but there's a big problem with that. I'll give you a problem from the Islamic theological framework, right? And that problem is, say, God says in the Quran, God says He will forget them like they forgot Him.
Okay.
Now, as a Muslim, when I read that verse of the Quran in which God says, I will forget them like they forgot God, right? I know that forgetfulness is not the same as for a human being and God, because God would be deficient. So forgetfulness in the human sense is you have a cognitive deficiency, you forgot to recollect a particular memory, retrieve it in some way or the other, and God, it doesn't apply to. So also this would apply to things like, okay, so when it comes to the Islamic theological framework, and also in Christianity, this attributes of God which I mentioned, like the hand of God, or these types of things. But we know, as Muslims and Christians, and again, I may be making statements about Christian theology which may not be correct, and also I believe this is the same for the Jewish people, is when it does say things like the hand of God, we know that doesn't mean a physical, tendons and this type of thing. That in Islam we have a whole discussion on this, but we wouldn't take forgetfulness or other types of things and then say, okay, it's exactly like a human thing, right?
Yeah.
So that is what did you call it?
Univocal. So
univocal.
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Yeah. So there's three different distinctions between language use. You have univocal, equivocal, and analogical. So basically, univocal means you use the word in the same way in a different context.
And that's the view you hold?
That's the view I hold.
Sure.
Equivocal means you're using the word, but it doesn't mean the same thing. Okay, so I'll give you an example. When I use the word bat, and you need to ask me what I'm talking about, because I could be talking about a cricket bat, I could be talking about a bat that's flying around.
Or the wing of a hospital.
Or the wing, yeah. So those words are using in an equivocal sense.
Equivocal.
Yes. Univocal just means, like, let's say blue. If I say I have blue shoes and you have blue shoes, or the sky is blue, I'm using blue in the exact same way. And then analogical is when you're saying you're using it in a similar way. It's very similar to it, but it's not exactly the same. Analogical gets a little bit more difficult, so let's just go with the first two. Univocal, I'm trying to say to you that I don't believe you can use equivocal language when you're talking about God. Because you're saying, yeah, God is good, but God is not good in the same way that we mean goodness. God is powerful, but God is not powerful in the same way that we mean power. Because then the question is, what are you meaning then when you say God is powerful? We only understand it because we have an understanding of what power is in our context. We then apply that, but then what we do is that we qualify it when we apply it to God. We say God is powerful, but God is all powerful. God is knowing, but God is all knowing. God is good, but God is all good or perfectly good. And so we qualify. So we say God is good in this way that we mean goodness. Mother Teresa is good, but she's not good exactly like God because God is perfectly good. But we are using the word in the same way in those different contexts.
But Josh, isn't there a problem? Not only as in Muslims would deny that use of language, but also I think some Christians would also say that that's not.
So this view was debated in Christian theology throughout the century. So you have Thomas Aquinas. He went against the univocal view.
I would expect him to.
He went against it, but he then at one point he was holding to the equivocal, but then he believed that was problematic, so he took the analogical route. You have Moses, Maimonides.
So just about this. Yes. So that would mean St. Aquinas would not accept this argument.
No, he wouldn't accept. He never forwarded this argument. But I'm not a Thomist, so I don't hold to everything that Aquinas says.
You're not what?
I'm not a Thomist, so I don't hold to everything that Aquinas says.
Yeah.
He is very amazing, but in areas I would disagree with him. Because I would say that.
So from if I just to clarify, that would basically mean a large section of Christianity. Christians would not accept this argument because of language.
I would say that actually contemporary sort of philosophy of religion, looking at religious language, they are taking more the univocal route.
So what would you say, just for my knowledge, because I'm ignorant on this, William Lane Craig, what does he hold?
Univocal.
Really?
Yeah, 100%.
So
univocal, him, Swinburne, Plantinga.
Alistair McGrath?
I'm not certain about McGrath because he's more of a theologian than a philosopher. So I don't look into him. But let's say the three main Christian thinkers will be Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, and then to a lesser extent William Lane Craig. They all share this view, and so there's this debate in Christian theology between something called classical theism and theistic personalism. So basically,
theistic personalism and classical theism.
Yeah, theistic personalism basically says that God is a person like us, but he is a supernatural person. He is all-powerful, all-knowing. So it's the view I'm arguing for.
Right.
Saying God is actually a person like us, but he's not limited like us in our power, limited in the knowledge, limited in goodness.
And that fits the univocal
view. But then you'll have the classical theists who argue more the Thomistic route, and say actually we don't believe this theistic personalism. The main idea is because of divine simplicity. I don't know if you ever heard that term.
Yeah, this.
So God is without parts. So God is not composed of any parts.
I think Keith Ward uses this.
Maybe he might use it. I'm not really certain. But it's basically Thomas was very, very strong. Thomas Aquinas on this idea that God is simple. In a divine simplicity sense, just basically means God lacks all parts, and so what God has, God is identical to. Now, so God is identical to His goodness, God is identical to His power, God is identical to His essence. Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I'll give you I'll give you a little Islamic theological sort of nugget here, right? The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Reflect about creation, do not reflect about God, because you cannot basically grasp the essence of God except by believing in Him." So when it comes to these types of things, it kind of reminds me of, the whole discussion around good.
Okay.
What is good, right? And two people one may be a consequentialist and one may be a Kantian. They may disagree on good. One may be a theist or an atheist, but they both know what they're talking about. There's like that common denominator. So when it comes to God, we wouldn't go as far as I think what Christian theologians have been doing, which is you take it to such a discussion where it's almost like everyone's climbing up the tree, people go onto different branches, and then they're talking past each other. Because it depends on which language view you hold on to and which framework you hold on to. And again, I would go back to my initial point, which is God's message should be very simple. And the Islamic theological framework is extremely simple. And we would also argue that Moses, Abraham, and all the rest of God's prophets, they would be completely baffled by, say, these sort of discussions. They would believe what I believe, right? They wouldn't go down this sort of route.
Yeah, but I think
because God's not the author of confusion. That's one Bible verse I know.
Okay. But where I'll have to disagree with you is that I do agree with you that things should be simple, but when we are trying to understand things specifically which are ontologically different from us, they can be difficult to grasp and understand. So I would say with you, we have a shared problem with, for example, understanding what it means for God to be all-knowing. So being omniscient. You will hold to as a Muslim, God is omniscient, he knows all things. I will hold to it, I'll hold to it as well as a Christian. But then we will have problems because we're trying to understand, well, God is all-knowing, but what about the idea of human free will? Does human free will negate God being all-knowing? Can he know, does he have foreknowledge? Can he know the future?
You're very right, Josh. And Christians would get into those discussions, and some Muslims did in the past as well. However, from an Islamic perspective, we would simply say, God is all-knowing, and human beings have free choice. We can take actions. Logically, how do you make sense of it? We as Muslims would simply say we just believe in it, right?
That's difficult though, because I mean,
it's not really.
No, but think about it. I mean, I can understand that if you're in a non-pluralistic environment where everyone's a Muslim or everyone shares the same worldview as you, it's very easy to just say, yeah, we have these things which are difficult to reconcile logically, but we just believe it. But if we're in the 21st century pluralistic environment where there are different options in play here, and people want to understand which one has truth value, which worldview actually has truth value. Well, if one worldview is saying that there is this God who is all-knowing and he has foreknowledge, he knows the future, but yet also you're required to believe that we have free will, and probably in the libertarian sense, that you can choose A or choose B without being necessitated to choose any one, then you have a problem, because you're saying, well, how does God have this knowledge? Because if I'm going to choose a pizza tomorrow, instead of a burger to eat for, let's say, dinner or something like that, did God know that before? Well, yeah, he did know it before, but then does that mean then that I have a choice? Because
no, look,
I can falsify his knowledge.
I get your issue.
So I'm saying my problem is, you can't escape the question if we want to argue for the truth value.
But we're not escaping the question. We're not escaping the question. We're just giving the actual answer. From the Islamic perspective, even discussing, having deep theological discussions about predestination is something which is discouraged, right? Now, in terms of, like you said, in the 21st century, in the 21st century, there's lots of options and people are having these sort of discussions, these questions are opened up. But remember, look, there's nothing new under the sun. If we look back at during the time of Jesus, right? I think it was a Roman soldier or a Greek soldier who came up to either Jesus or one of his disciples. And there was some sort of question about God, and one of the Greek or Roman soldiers, because they were affected by Hellenistic philosophy, they said something to the effect of, what is God? Or something like this. I don't remember this exact passage in the Bible. But as in, from the early days of Christianity and the early days of Islam, you've always had many different philosophies competing. It's not that in the 21st century we've had this and we haven't had this in the past. The second thing is, and I do this on